There is a very specific type of thief in this world who doesn't wear a ski mask or carry a weapon. Instead, they wear freshly pressed polo shirts, carry a clipboard, and hide behind the absolute unchecked power of a homeowners association. They steal from their neighbors in broad daylight, nickel and diming entire communities under the guise of neighborhood beautification. They get away with it because they rely on one simple fact. Most normal, hardworking people are too busy to read the financial disclosures buried in page 47 of their HOA bylaws. But I am not a normal person. I am a forensic accountant. For the last 12 years, I have worked as a private auditor for high net worth clients and corporate boards. My entire career is built on finding money that people have tried very, very hard to hide. I hunt financial ghosts for a living. So, when the president of my new HOA decided to use me as his personal ATM, he had absolutely no idea he was inviting an apex predator directly into his own financial ecosystem. It started exactly 3 days after I moved into my new house. It was a beautiful, quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with perfectly manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. I had just finished unpacking the last of my boxes when I found a crisp, white envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal citation from the community HOA, signed by a man named Richard Vance, the association president. The citation was for a staggering $1,000. The listed violation was unauthorized commercial vehicle parking. I was completely baffled. I hadn't parked any commercial vehicles on my property. I called the phone number listed at the bottom of the letter, and Richard answered on the second ring. His voice was dripping with that specific, sickening kind of fake suburban politeness. When I asked him to explain the fine, he smugly informed me that the moving truck I had hired to bring my furniture into the house had been parked on the street for 6 hours. According to an obscure subclause he had personally written into the neighborhood rules, commercial moving trucks were only allowed for a maximum of 4 hours. Since I had gone over the limit, I was being heavily penalized. I took a deep breath, trying to remain reasonable. I explained that I was a new resident, the truck was actively unloading my entire life, and I hadn't even received the official welcome packet or the rulebook yet. Richard chuckled. It was a dry, condescending sound that made my blood run instantly cold. He told me that ignorance of the law is not an excuse, and if I didn't pay the $1,000 by the end of the week, he would start applying a compounding daily late fee of $50. He then casually mentioned that if the debt reached $3,000, the HOA had the legal authority to place a lien on my new house and initiate foreclosure proceedings. He was threatening to steal my home over a moving truck. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I simply said thank you, hung up the phone, and sat down at my kitchen island. I opened my laptop and started digging. If Richard was this aggressive, this completely unhinged about a 2-hour parking violation with a brand new neighbor, he wasn't doing it just for the power trip. Nobody enforces rules that strictly unless they are desperate for the revenue. And if he was desperate for revenue in an affluent neighborhood where 70 homes were already paying $500 a month in mandatory dues, that meant the money was going somewhere it shouldn't. By midnight, I had pulled the publicly available tax records for our homeowners association. It was a basic 990 form, the standard tax return for a nonprofit organization. To the untrained eye, it looked completely normal. But to a forensic auditor, it was a glowing, radioactive red flag. According to the document, our HOA was pulling in over $400,000 a year in resident dues. Yet, the operating account had exactly $1,200 in cash reserves. The money was vanishing. Over $300,000 a year was being completely zeroed out under a single, incredibly vague expense category labeled simply as landscape and infrastructure maintenance. I looked out my front window at the street. The grass was cut, sure, but the neighborhood pool had been closed for repairs for 2 years, and the streetlights were ancient. There was absolutely no way $300,000 was being spent on lawn care. Richard thought he had just bullied a helpless new neighbor into paying a fake fine. Instead, He had just handed a loaded gun to a financial sniper. I wasn't just going to refuse to pay his ridiculous citation. I was going to financially dissect his entire life, track down every single stolen penny, and completely destroy him. The next morning, I did not write a check for $1,000. Instead, I drafted a highly specific, legally binding certified letter and mailed it directly to Richard Vance and the HOA Management Company. Under our state property code, any member of a homeowners association has the absolute legal right to review all financial records, vendor contracts, bank statements, and board meeting minutes within 10 business days of a written request. I demanded the last 3 years of complete, unredacted general ledgers. I knew he would never willingly hand them over, but in my profession, the refusal to provide documents is often the loudest confession of guilt you will ever hear. While I waited for the legal clock to run out on my records request, I initiated my own parallel investigation. I focused my crosshairs entirely on that massive, vague line item draining the budget: landscape and infrastructure maintenance. According to the State Registry of Corporations, our HOA had an exclusive ironclad contract with a vendor called Apex Property Solutions. They were being paid exactly $25,000 on the first of every single month. That is a staggering, completely unjustifiable amount of money for mowing lawns and maintaining a few streetlights in a 70-home subdivision. I ran Apex Property Solutions through my firm's proprietary commercial database. The company was a total ghost. They had no active website, no listed commercial phone number, no fleet of branded trucks, and absolutely no online reviews. Their registered business address wasn't a corporate office or a warehouse. It was a tiny P.O. box located in a rundown strip mall 2 towns over. But criminals who think they are untouchable always leave a paper trail. You cannot legally open a corporate bank account without filing articles of incorporation with the Secretary of State. I bypassed the public portals and pulled the foundational tax documents for Apex Property Solutions. The registered agent and primary shareholder was listed as a woman named Eleanor Hayes. The name did not immediately match Richard Vance, but forensic accounting is essentially just extreme patience mixed with data analysis. I spent the next 4 hours aggressively cross-referencing public property records, historical marriage certificates, and archived social media accounts. It took deep digging, but the puzzle pieces finally snapped together with a sickening clarity. Eleanor Hayes was Richard's sister-in-law. It was his wife's younger sister. She lived in a completely different time zone, worked as a part-time yoga instructor, and had absolutely zero background in commercial landscaping, construction, or property management. The scheme was brilliantly simple and incredibly illegal. Richard was using his unchecked position as HOA President to single-handedly approve a $300,000 annual contract to a shell company owned by his wife's family. They were likely hiring cheap, unlicensed local kids to cut the neighborhood grass for a few $100 a week in cash and pocketing the massive difference. He was systematically draining our mandatory neighborhood dues to fund his own lavish lifestyle. He was using petty, aggressive fines like my moving truck citation to cover the gaps and intimidate residents whenever the HOA operating account got dangerously low. On day 9 of my formal records request, my doorbell rang. I opened it to find Richard Vance standing on my porch. He was not wearing his usual fake, polite suburban smile. His arms were crossed, his face was flushed red, and he looked absolutely furious. He aggressively informed me that my request for financial documents was harassing the volunteer board and that he was officially denying it under a bylaws clause that supposedly protected vendor privacy. He then stepped closer, leaning into my personal space, and told me that because I had refused to pay my initial fine, it had now doubled. He proudly declared that he was officially referring my property to the HOA's legal counsel to place a lien on my house. Richard thought he was intimidating me. He genuinely believed I was just a difficult new neighbor who would eventually break down and write a check out of pure terror of losing my home. He had absolutely no idea that my front porch security camera was quietly recording every single word of his extortion attempt in high-definition audio. I did not raise my voice. I looked him dead in the eye, smiled warmly, and told him that I looked forward to hearing from his lawyers. As he scoffed and stormed off my property, I locked the door and walked straight back to my home office. It was time to stop digging for ghosts and start building a federal trap. Exactly 14 days after Richard stormed off my front porch, the certified letter arrived in my mailbox. It was heavy, printed on expensive legal paper, and stamped by the county clerk's office. Richard had actually done it. He had officially filed a property lien against my brand new home for an unpaid debt that had now magically ballooned to $3,500 with fabricated administrative fees. He was trying to hold my house hostage. When normal people receive a property lien, they usually panic. They call the HOA, beg for forgiveness, and write a check just to make the legal nightmare stop. But when I held that document in my hands, I actually smiled. By escalating this to a formal legal proceeding, Richard had made the single most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. When an HOA places a lien on your property, you have the absolute right to contest it in civil court. And the moment a judge opens a civil case, you immediately unlock the most devastating weapon in the American legal system, the power of subpoena. I didn't call Richard. I didn't try to negotiate. I immediately hired a ruthless, high-end real estate litigation attorney. I didn't hire her to defend me against the moving truck fine. I hired her to file an aggressive countersuit against the HOA board for fraudulent billing, extortion, and breach of fiduciary duty. When you allege financial fraud in a civil lawsuit, the court enters a phase called discovery. This means neither Richard nor his cheap HOA lawyers could hide behind their ridiculous privacy bylaws anymore. Richard's attorney desperately tried to file a motion to quash our subpoenas, arguing that our request for the HOA's bank records was a fishing expedition. But the civil court judge took exactly one look at my perfectly documented initial records request, Richard's blatant refusal, and the heavily redacted tax returns. The judge didn't just deny Richard's motion, he signed a sweeping court order compelling the immediate release of the HOA's entire general ledger and the banking history of Apex Property Solutions. Within 48 hours, my attorney handed me a massive encrypted hard drive containing the raw, unfiltered financial data. I locked the door to my home office, brewed a pot of black coffee, and began the digital autopsy. It was even worse than I had initially calculated. I tracked the $25,000 monthly payments leaving our neighborhood operating account. The money consistently landed in a regional corporate bank account registered to Eleanor Hayes, Richard's sister-in-law. But the funds never stayed there. I analyzed the outgoing ledger and found a precise, recurring pattern. Within 2 days of every single HOA deposit, exactly $22,000 was instantly wired out of Eleanor's account. She was keeping $3,000 a month as her personal cut for acting as the corporate middleman, paying a few $100 in cash to local teenagers to occasionally mow the common areas, and funneling the massive remaining bulk out of the state. But where was the $22,000 going? This is where my 12 years of hunting financial ghosts turned from a profession into a lethal weapon. Normal lawyers stop when the money leaves domestic jurisdiction. Forensic accountants do not. I tracked the routing numbers on the outgoing wire transfers through the international SWIFT banking system. The money wasn't going to a legitimate landscaping supplier. It was crossing the ocean. The funds were being systematically funneled directly into a private, numbered wealth account at the Bank of the Cayman Islands. It was a textbook offshore tax evasion and money laundering structure. Richard wasn't just skimming off the top to buy a nicer car. He had set up an offshore blind trust in the Caribbean to hoard the stolen neighborhood dues, entirely tax-free, where he thought the United States government could never find it. I ran the historical data. Over the last 4 years, Richard Vance had siphoned nearly $1.2 million out of our quiet, middle-class suburban neighborhood. I drove to the local office supply store and bought a thick, vibrant red folder. I meticulously printed out the bank statements, the international wire transfer receipts, the fraudulent vendor contracts, and the articles of incorporation for Eleanor's shell company. I placed a bold printed label on the front of the folder that read, "Confidential Account." I was holding the undeniable mathematical proof of massive federal wire fraud in my hands. Richard thought he was the untouchable king of our street, bullying families over parking violations. He had no idea I was about to introduce him to the federal government. The next scheduled Homeowners Association meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the stale, fluorescent-lit basement of our local community center. Typically, these meetings were attended by a handful of bored retirees complaining about trash pickup schedules. But tonight was entirely different. Word had spread rapidly through the neighborhood Facebook group about my lawsuit and the property lien Richard had slapped on my house. The room was packed with nearly 50 residents. Richard sat at the folding table at the front of the room, flanked by two other board members who looked like terrified hostages. He was wearing his signature polo shirt, practically glowing with smug authority. He truly believed this was his moment to publicly execute me. He wanted to use my situation as a terrifying cautionary tale to ensure no one else in the neighborhood ever dared to question his absolute power. He called the meeting to order and immediately bypassed the standard agenda. He grabbed his microphone, cleared his throat, and launched into a highly rehearsed, condescending speech about community standards. He looked directly at me, sitting quietly in the third row. He announced to the crowded room that a certain new resident was not only refusing to pay a simple, justified parking fine, but was actively draining the HOA's limited legal defense funds with a frivolous civil lawsuit. He shook his head in fake disappointment, claiming that because of my selfish actions, the board might have to raise the monthly dues for everyone next year to cover the legal costs. The room began to murmur. A few neighbors glared at me. Richard was weaponizing the community against me, and he was doing it brilliantly. He asked if there was any new business before he officially moved to foreclose on my property. I stood up. The murmurs instantly stopped. The room went dead silent as I stepped out of my row and walked down the center aisle, holding nothing but my phone and the thick, vibrant red folder. I stopped directly in front of Richard's table. I placed my phone face up on the podium, ensuring the voice memo app was actively recording. I looked at the crowd, then back at Richard. Keeping my voice completely level and clinical, I asked him a very simple question. I asked him to confirm, on the official public record, that the HOA's primary landscaping vendor, Apex Property Solutions, was a legitimate, independent contractor that he had no personal or financial ties to. Richard laughed. It was a nervous, dismissive sound, but his ego wouldn't let him back down in front of an audience. He leaned into his microphone and confidently stated that Apex was a highly reputable company that provided excellent value to the neighborhood, and that any suggestion otherwise was bordering on slander. He had just dug his own grave, and he had done it on tape. I opened the red folder. I pulled out the first document and held it up for the front row to see. I announced that Apex Property Solutions was not a landscaping company. It was a shell corporation registered to a P.O. box owned entirely by a woman named Eleanor Hayes. I turned to the crowd and informed them that Eleanor Hayes was Richard's sister-in-law, a yoga instructor living 3 states away. The color instantly drained from Richard's face. His smug smile vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. He lunged for the microphone, shouting that the meeting was adjourned, but I didn't stop. I pulled out the next stack of papers. My voice cut through his shouting. I told the room exactly how their $500 monthly dues were being spent. I detailed the $25,000 monthly wire transfers. I explained how Eleanor kept $3,000 as a laundering fee and wired the remaining $22,000 out of the country. I dropped the heavy stack of international banking receipts directly onto Richard's table. I told the 70 silent, horrified neighbors that for the last 4 years, their hard-earned money hadn't been paying for neighborhood upkeep. It had been systematically funneled into a private, numbered offshore wealth account in the Cayman Islands, controlled exclusively by Richard Vance. Chaos erupted. People started shouting. A man in the back row threw his chair. Neighbors who had been glaring at me 3 minutes ago were now surging toward the front table, screaming at Richard, demanding to know where their money was. The 2 other board members physically backed away from him in sheer terror. Richard was trembling. He was completely trapped. He pointed a shaking finger at me and screamed over the noise of the furious crowd that I had illegally hacked his accounts. He yelled that he was calling the police to have me arrested for corporate espionage and trespassing. I leaned down close to his face, resting my hands on the table. The noise of the angry neighborhood faded into the background. I smiled a cold, terrifying smile and told him that he didn't need to bother calling the local police. I told him I had already forwarded the contents of the red folder to someone far more dangerous. The chaos in that community center basement was absolute and beautifully destructive. Richard didn't even try to defend himself anymore. As furious neighbors surged forward to grab the printed banking receipts scattered across the folding table, his smug, authoritative persona completely evaporated. He looked like a cornered rat. He scrambled backward, knocking over his own chair, and practically sprinted out the emergency exit door into the parking lot, leaving the other 2 terrified board members to face the wrath of 70 screaming residents. I didn't stay to watch the rest of the shouting match. I calmly picked up my empty red folder, walked out the front doors, and drove back to my house. My part of the investigation was entirely finished. Now, it was time for the federal government to do what they do best. 2 days before that disastrous HOA meeting, I had compiled every single piece of evidence into a massive, heavily encrypted digital dossier. But I didn't send it to the local police. Local cops deal with noise complaints and stolen bicycles. They do not have the jurisdiction, the budget, or the forensic accounting units to dismantle international offshore trusts. Instead, I submitted the entire package directly to the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service, along with a formal whistleblower report to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. When you hand the IRS a perfectly indexed, mathematically undeniable roadmap of $1 million tax evasion and international money laundering scheme, they do not drag their feet. They move with terrifying, surgical precision. Nothing happened on Wednesday. The neighborhood was buzzing with gossip, and the HOA management company issued a panicked mass email stating that Richard Vance had temporarily stepped down pending an internal review. Richard's house stayed completely dark. His expensive imported SUV never left the driveway. He was hiding, desperately trying to figure out how to cover his tracks or quietly move the offshore money before the local authorities got involved. He had no idea that a federal grand jury was already reviewing his bank records in a sealed courtroom 300 miles away. The climax of my revenge arrived on Thursday morning at exactly 6:15. I was sitting on my front porch, sipping a hot cup of black coffee and watching the sun rise over our quiet suburban street. The neighborhood was dead silent. Then, the silence was shattered by the low, heavy rumble of high-powered engines. A convoy of 3 unmarked matte black Chevrolet Suburbans, followed closely by 2 local police cruisers with their lights flashing silently, turned onto our street. They didn't park neatly by the curb. They aggressively pulled right up onto Richard's perfectly manicured front lawn, crushing his expensive flower beds. Doors flew open. Over a dozen men and women wearing heavy tactical vests with the letters IRS, CID, and FBI printed in massive yellow font on their backs swarmed the property. It was a full-scale, coordinated federal raid. 2 armed agents marched up to Richard's custom mahogany front door and pounded on it hard enough to rattle the windows. I heard the muffled, commanding shout of, "Federal agents, open the door with your hands visible!" echo across the quiet street. Porch lights started flicking on up and down the block as sleepy neighbors stepped out in their pajamas, their jaws dropping in absolute shock as they witnessed the undisputed king of the HOA being raided by the United States government. A minute later, the door opened. Richard stood there in a silk bathrobe, looking incredibly small, frail, and completely disoriented. The aggressive, bullying dictator who had threatened to steal my home over a moving truck was entirely gone. He raised his shaking hands in the air as two agents immediately grabbed him, spun him around, and clamped heavy steel handcuffs tightly around his wrists. They didn't read him a noise ordinance violation. They read him his Miranda rights for federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit money laundering. They walked him down the front steps of his beautiful home in his slippers and placed him in the back of a police cruiser. But the raid was just beginning. Over the next 4 hours, I sat on my porch and watched absolute financial devastation unfold. Agents systematically carried out dozens of cardboard boxes filled with physical files, multiple desktop computers, and every piece of electronics in the house. Then, a heavy-duty flatbed tow truck arrived. The federal agents had secured asset seizure warrants. Because Richard had bought his luxury vehicles using stolen, laundered neighborhood dues, the government was taking them back. I watched with a warm, deeply satisfying feeling in my chest as his $80,000 SUV was hoisted onto the back of the tow truck and hauled away. Richard Vance was gone, but his nightmare was only just starting, because the IRS doesn't just put you in prison. They take absolutely everything you have ever touched. The federal raid on Richard's house was only half of the coordinated strike. While he was sitting in the back of a police cruiser in his silk bathrobe, another tactical team was kicking down the doors of a trendy, upscale yoga studio 3 states away. Eleanor Hayes, the sister-in-law who thought she had found the perfect risk-free side hustle, was arrested right in the middle of a morning meditation class. She was charged with federal wire fraud and conspiracy to commit money laundering. Unlike Richard, Eleanor possessed absolutely no loyalty or mental toughness. The moment the federal agent sat her down in an interrogation room and slid a printed spreadsheet of her $22,000 wire transfers across the metal table, she completely broke. She didn't even ask for a lawyer. She immediately signed a full cooperation agreement, turning state's witness and handing the government every single email, text message, and encrypted phone call she had ever exchanged with Richard regarding the stolen HOA funds. With Eleanor's full confession added to my forensic dossier, Richard's legal defense instantly evaporated into thin air. He hired a high-priced, white-collar defense attorney who tried to argue that the funds were just being held in a foreign investment account for future neighborhood improvements. It was a laughable, desperate lie. The United States Department of Justice does not negotiate with people who hide over $1 million in the Caribbean. Because I had filed the whistleblower report through the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, the IRS was able to invoke international banking treaties. The Cayman Islands are no longer the untouchable pirate haven they were in the 1990s. Under federal pressure, the offshore bank froze Richard's secret account and repatriated the entire $1.2 million back to the United States government. But the absolute beauty of the American tax code is that it is unapologetically ruthless. The IRS requires you to pay income tax on all revenue, even if that revenue is illegally obtained through embezzlement and fraud. Because Richard had never declared the stolen money on his personal tax returns, he was hit with massive federal tax evasion charges, compounded by years of severe financial penalties and interest. He owed the government more money than he had actually stolen. To satisfy this massive federal debt, the IRS initiated civil asset forfeiture. They didn't just take his luxury SUV. They seized his investment portfolios, froze his legitimate retirement accounts, and placed a massive federal tax lien on his pristine suburban home. The very same man who had threatened to foreclose on my house over a fabricated $1,000 parking violation was now having his own home legally stripped away by the federal government to pay restitution for his crimes. Facing over 20 years in federal prison and buried under an insurmountable mountain of airtight financial evidence, Richard didn't even make it to trial. 3 months after the raid on our quiet street, he signed a comprehensive plea deal. He pleaded guilty to multiple felony counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering. The judge sentenced him to 96 months in a federal penitentiary, followed by a lifetime of supervised release and court-ordered financial restitution. He went from being the wealthy, untouchable king of our suburban neighborhood to a completely bankrupt, disgraced federal inmate sharing a concrete cell. Back in our neighborhood, the fallout was swift and absolute. The remaining two HOA board members, terrified that they might be implicated in Richard's massive fraud, immediately resigned in disgrace and put their houses up for sale. The property management company, desperate to distance themselves from a federal criminal investigation, completely dropped our neighborhood as a client. As for the ridiculous $3,500 property lien Richard had maliciously placed on my new home, it was immediately invalidated and expunged from the county records by a civil court judge, who also ordered the frozen HOA accounts to reimburse every single penny of my legal fees. With the old, corrupt regime completely dissolved and Richard Vance sitting in a federal penitentiary for the next 8 years, our suburban neighborhood was effectively left without any governing body. For the first time in years, the residents were free. The emergency town hall meeting was held 3 weeks after the federal raid, right back in the same fluorescent-lit basement of the community center. But this time, there was no hostility. There was no smug dictator sitting at the front table demanding compliance. The room was packed with nearly every single homeowner in the subdivision, and the energy was entirely different. It felt like a collective exhale. A temporary volunteer oversight committee was formed on the spot. Because I had single-handedly tracked down the stolen money and navigated the massive legal fallout, the neighborhood unanimously voted me in as the lead financial advisor for the transition. I didn't want the power, but I did want to make sure the money Richard had stolen was properly handled once the federal government finished processing the asset forfeiture and returned the funds to the community. Over the next 6 months, the IRS systematically liquidated Richard's hidden assets, including the sale of his beautiful suburban home, right across the street from mine. The federal government kept their massive cut for tax evasion penalties, but under the victim restitution laws, the remaining balance of the recovered funds, nearly $700,000, was legally transferred back into a newly established, highly transparent, and heavily audited trust account for our neighborhood. We didn't just rebuild the HOA, we completely dismantled its power structure. We rewrote the bylaws from the ground up, stripping away the ability to issue arbitrary fines, place property liens for minor infractions, or sign vendor contracts without a full, public, competitive bidding process. We reduced the mandatory monthly dues from an extortionate $500 down to a completely reasonable $90, just enough to cover basic communal landscaping and insurance. With the recovered funds from Richard's offshore accounts, we finally fixed everything he had neglected for years. We completely resurfaced the cracked neighborhood pool, installed modern, energy-efficient streetlights, and built a beautiful new playground for the local kids. And we did it all in cash, without raising a single cent in taxes or special assessments. Richard Vance thought he was untouchable. He thought his position as HOA President gave him the absolute right to treat his neighbors like personal ATMs, bullying families over moving trucks and parking spaces, while he quietly siphoned over $1 million into the Caribbean. He thought he was the smartest person in the room because he knew how to exploit the fine print of a neighborhood rulebook. But there is a very specific type of predator in this world who doesn't care about neighborhood rules. They care about numbers, tax codes, and international wire transfers. When Richard decided to extort a forensic accountant over a $1,000 moving fine, he didn't just pick the wrong neighbor, he picked the absolute worst possible person to ever cross. He tried to steal my house. So I took his money, his freedom, and everything he ever owned, and handed it directly to the federal government. As I sat on my front porch a year later, watching the new family move into Richard's old house, a large commercial moving truck pulled right up onto the street and parked directly in front of their driveway. It sat there for 6 hours, blocking half the lane while the movers unloaded boxes. I took a sip of my coffee, smiled, and didn't say a single word. In our neighborhood, moving trucks were finally allowed to take as much time as they needed,